A decision that would change everything. Jack Henderson's worn leather gloves creaked as he gripped the steering wheel of his old, rusted pickup truck, the engine rumbling as he navigated the quiet streets of Cedar Grove. The evening sky was beginning to fade, the hues of orange and pink casting long, melancholic shadows over the small town. There was a certain stillness in the air, an almost palpable weight that hung over Jack, mirroring the doubts and fears creeping into his mind. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving not just to a house, but to a destiny that he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for. In the passenger seat beside him sat a manila envelope, its edges frayed from being held too tightly. Inside were the adoption papers for 3 boys, Noah, Kyle, and Martin. They were only a few months removed from losing both parents in a horrific car accident, parents Jack had known for years. Jack hadn't expected to be part of their lives beyond the scope of the house he was renovating for them, but fate had other plans. As Jack turned down Main Street, memories of the boys' parents flooded his thoughts. Their mother, Sarah, had been warm-hearted and full of life, always making Jack laugh with her quick wit and kindness. Her husband, Marcus, had been quiet but strong, someone Jack had always respected. They had been a family who was now gone, leaving 3 young brothers without anyone to look after them. The images of that fateful funeral 2 months ago were still fresh in Jack's mind. He had watched Noah, the eldest at 10 years old, try so hard to hold it together for his younger brothers. Kyle, only 8, had kept to himself, his usual bubbly energy drained as if the loss had aged him overnight. Little Martin, the youngest at just 7, had clung to his older siblings, his small body trembling as silent tears fell from his eyes. It was a heartbreaking sight, one Jack could never forget. He had been standing there, looking at the 3 of them, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then it hit him. If no one stepped in, if no one cared enough to help, these boys would be lost, trapped in a system that didn't have the time or resources to heal their broken hearts. Jack's truck rattled as it pulled into the gravel driveway of the house, the home where those 3 boys had once lived. It was eerily silent now, the windows dark and cold, like the house itself was mourning the loss of the family that had once filled it with laughter. Jack parked the truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the house, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressed down on his chest. He had never been a father. He had never been around kids long enough to understand the complexities of raising them. And yet, here he was, holding in his hands the chance to change 3 young lives. The boys had lost their parents, but Jack had the opportunity to give them something else, a chance to heal, to find a new sense of normalcy. And as much as he tried to convince himself that he was ready, a deep sense of uncertainty crept in. Was he really capable of taking on this challenge? Could he provide the kind of home they needed? Was he enough? As Jack took a deep breath, his thoughts shifted to Melinda, his late wife. It had been several years since she passed, yet the ache of her absence never quite left him. Melinda had always been the heart of their family, the one who encouraged Jack to open up and share his life with others. She had always wanted to adopt, had always dreamed of bringing children into their home. Jack had agreed to it, but life had gotten in the way, and the years had passed. What now? In the wake of tragedy, Jack found himself standing at a crossroads. Melinda's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to do the right thing. She would have wanted this. She would have embraced these boys with open arms, just as she had embraced him when they first met. Jack could almost hear her gentle laugh, see the way her eyes sparkled with compassion for others, and it was as though her spirit was there beside him, guiding him. With a sigh, Jack reached over and grabbed the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, unfolding the adoption papers that had been sent to him after he had expressed his willingness to take in the boys. The legalities and paperwork were straightforward, but they felt like an overwhelming burden. How could any form or piece of paper truly represent the commitment he was about to make? Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he thought about the challenges ahead. There would be no easy answers, no clear path to follow. He had no idea how to raise 3 boys, especially 3 boys who had just lost everything. Would they resent him for trying to fill a role they hadn't asked him to play? Would they find comfort in his presence, or would he just be a stranger to them, someone they were forced to live with because there was no other choice? His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he recalled their faces at the funeral, those empty, haunted eyes that still haunted him to this day. He thought of Noah's protective stance, always looking out for his younger brothers. He thought of Kyle's silence, his playful energy now dimmed by grief. And Martin, little Martin, who had barely understood the magnitude of the tragedy, but who had clung to Jack as though the man could somehow fill the void left behind. What would Melinda think? Jack whispered to himself, staring out at the horizon. He could almost... The first day together. The morning after Jack's decision, he awoke to a house that felt foreign, even though it was the very place he had known for years. He had spent the night in a quiet daze, his mind racing through every possible scenario for the future. He couldn't sleep, not fully, because he kept wondering how Noah, Kyle, and Martin were adjusting to this new reality. How could they? Everything they had known, everything they had loved, was gone in the blink of an eye. And now, here they were, thrust into the life of a stranger who was supposed to be their father. The house was eerily still when Jack finally pulled himself out of bed. The familiar creaks of the floorboards under his feet felt hollow in the silence. He stood in the doorway of the boys' room for a long moment, unsure of how to proceed. Noah was curled up in a ball on the top bunk, his body stiff as though trying to escape the weight of the world. Kyle was sprawled across the floor, his arms flung out like a starfish. And Martin, little Martin, was tucked in the corner of the room, clutching his stuffed bear as though it were a lifeline. Jack stepped back and went downstairs, trying to settle his thoughts over a cup of coffee. The boys needed breakfast, of course, but Jack had no idea what they liked, what they might want to eat. It seemed so trivial in the grand scheme of things, but there were moments when the smallest details felt overwhelming. What if they didn't like the food? What if they didn't want anything at all? He was still standing there in the kitchen, staring at the cereal boxes and wondering what to do next when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Noah standing in the doorway, his face pale and eyes still tired. "Morning," Jack said softly, not wanting to startle him. Noah nodded, not meeting Jack's gaze. There was a long, heavy silence between them before Noah spoke. "What are we supposed to do now?" Noah's voice was small, uncertain, like a child who was trying to make sense of something far beyond his years. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He had no answers. What could he say? He was just as unsure as they were, but he knew one thing. He couldn't afford to let them feel lost. Not today, not any day. "We're going to figure it out together," Jack replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. "But today we start by having some breakfast. I don't know what you guys like, but I can make pancakes or eggs, or whatever you want." Noah didn't respond immediately, and Jack could feel the hesitation in the air. The boy was testing him, probably wondering if Jack would be able to follow through with his promises, or if he would back out the moment things got tough. Finally, Noah spoke. "Pancakes are fine." His voice was barely a whisper, but Jack could hear the faintest trace of hope in it. Maybe he was testing Jack, or maybe, just maybe, he was willing to give this new life a chance. Jack moved to the counter and started gathering the ingredients for pancakes. As he mixed the batter, he kept glancing over at Noah, who was still standing in the doorway, watching him with wary eyes. It felt strange, preparing a meal for someone else, especially someone who had been through so much. Jack wasn't sure how long it had been since the boys had sat down for a proper meal. The house had been filled with empty spaces where love and care used to be. He could see the faint remnants of their old life. The toys left abandoned in corners, the family photos still hanging on the walls. Yet everything felt like a memory, a ghost of what used to be. It wasn't until the smell of pancakes began to fill the air that Kyle and Martin finally emerged from their room. Kyle shuffled into the kitchen, his hair tousled, eyes barely open. He took a seat at the table without saying a word, as if the very act of sitting down at a table was foreign to him. Martin followed shortly behind, holding onto his bear tightly, as if it was his only source of comfort. Jack placed a plate of pancakes in front of each of them, along with a glass of milk, but the boys didn't dive into their breakfast as he had expected. They sat there, staring at the food in front of them, as if they didn't know what to do next. Jack took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," he said gently, "but you can always tell me if you need something." Noah was the first to break the silence. He picked up his fork and poked at his pancakes, but didn't take a bite. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, his voice almost angry. "You don't even know us. You're just doing this because you feel sorry for us. But you shouldn't have to." Jack's heart sank. He had expected resistance, but hearing it out loud still stung. He knew Noah was angry. He knew the boy wanted answers. But Jack didn't have any. All he had was the truth, and for better or worse, that was all he could offer. "Noah," Jack said, his voice low and calm, "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I'm doing this because I believe in you. All three of you. You've been through something no one should ever have to go through. And I can't undo that. But I can be here. I can give you a home. I can help you through this. That's all I'm trying to do." The room went silent again, the weight of Jack's words hanging in the air. The boys didn't respond, but Jack could see the smallest shift in their expressions. For the first time since they had arrived, there was the faintest glimmer of something other than pain in their eyes. Uncertainty, yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little bit of hope. After a long moment, Kyle finally took a bite of his pancakes. Then Martin did the same. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jack sat down at the table with them, unsure of what else to say, but knowing that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. They weren't ready for big conversations, not yet, but today they had broken bread together, and that, Jack knew, was a beginning. As the day wore on, Jack tried to keep things as normal as possible. He showed the boys around the house, letting them pick out their own rooms. The silence in the house was still heavy, but Jack kept talking, asking them about their favorite things, the books they liked to read, the games they used to play, anything to fill the quiet and let them know that they weren't alone. But even with all his efforts, Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy. The boys weren't ready to open up. They weren't ready to accept him, let alone see him as anything other than a stranger, and he couldn't force them to. But Jack also knew that this was just the beginning. It might take days, weeks, even months, but he wasn't going anywhere. He would keep showing up, keep trying, because that was what they needed. By the time evening fell, Jack was exhausted, but there was a quiet pride in his heart. It hadn't been a perfect day, far from it. There had been awkwardness, hesitation, and an ocean of unspoken words, but there had been progress too. They had shared a meal together. They had spoken. They had started, in their own way, to heal. And as Jack lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized that he was doing exactly what he had set out to do. He was offering these boys a chance. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. Small victories, deep struggles. Weeks had passed since the first awkward day together, and Jack had learned more about the boys than he could have anticipated. He had learned that Noah was a budding artist, spending hours drawing intricate designs in the notebooks he kept hidden under his bed. Kyle had a gift for music, always humming under his breath or tapping rhythms on anything he could find. Martin, the youngest, had an infectious curiosity that kept Jack on his toes, always asking questions about everything, from the stars in the sky to the way the grass felt under his bare feet. Yet, despite the small victories, the house still felt heavy. The boys weren't fully his yet, not in the way he had hoped. They were still adjusting, still grappling with the loss of their parents, still unsure of their place in this new life that Jack was trying to build for them. The awkward silences at dinner, the long stares into empty spaces, the hesitance to let Jack in, these things had become routine. And Jack was beginning to realize that healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't as simple as telling the boys everything would be okay. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a warm meal or a comforting word. Some nights, Jack found himself wondering if they would ever truly accept him as a father. After all, he wasn't their father. He wasn't anyone they had known. He was just the stranger who had come into their lives with promises that felt too big, too hopeful to be real. One of the hardest parts for Jack was the silence. The emotional weight of the house was like a living thing, pressing down on every conversation, every moment. The boys seemed so distant, so wrapped up in their own worlds of grief and confusion. And though Jack tried to be patient, to let them come to him when they were ready, he couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness in his heart. He wanted them to trust him. He wanted them to open up. It was early one morning when the first real breakthrough happened. Jack had just finished his coffee when he heard a faint noise coming from the living room. It was a soft, rustling sound, and when Jack went to investigate, he found Noah sitting on the couch, hunched over one of his sketchbooks. His pencil moved quickly over the page, and the concentrated look on his face made Jack pause in the doorway. "Everything all right?" Jack asked, his voice quiet, not wanting to interrupt Noah's focus. Noah didn't look up, but he nodded slowly. "Yeah, just drawing." His tone was flat, but Jack could tell that it wasn't just the drawing that had his attention. Noah had become more and more withdrawn over the past few weeks, and Jack had noticed how he seemed to carry a weight in his eyes, a weight that wasn't entirely visible but was palpable nonetheless. Jack stepped closer, cautiously sitting in the chair opposite the couch. "You're good at that," he said, glancing at the sketches scattered around the coffee table. Some were of simple things, trees, flowers, abstract shapes, but others were more complex, almost like maps of emotions, lines twisting and overlapping in ways that spoke to a deeper struggle. Noah didn't respond, but Jack could see the faintest shift in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a crack in the wall that Noah had carefully constructed between himself and the world. "You know," Jack began, choosing his words carefully, "when I was a kid, I used to draw too. I wasn't very good at it, but it helped me feel better, like I could put what I was feeling somewhere, not just keep it inside." Noah paused, his pencil hovering over the page for a moment before he slowly set it down. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of defensiveness and curiosity. Jack's heart tightened. He had expected this question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. He took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, meeting Noah's gaze. "I care because I see you," Jack said softly. "I see what you're going through. I know you're hurting, and I can't fix everything. I can't bring your parents back, but I can be here. I can listen. I can help you, however I can." There was a long silence after Jack spoke, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if Noah had heard him. But then, to his surprise, Noah stood up and silently handed him one of the sketches. It was a drawing of a house, an old, run-down house with cracks running through its walls, its windows dark. At the base of the house were 3 small figures, drawn with simple lines, standing together. Jack studied the drawing for a long moment, feeling a lump form in his throat. The house was a reflection of their lives, broken, fractured, but still standing. The 3 figures, though small and unassuming, were united, holding each other up, just as they were doing now, trying to piece together what remained of their family. "It's not much," Noah muttered, his voice barely audible. "But it's something." Jack looked at the drawing, and then back at Noah. "It's a lot," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. It's a beautiful thing, no? And in that moment, Jack realized something important, something that he had been blind to in his frustration. The boys were opening up, in their own quiet way. They weren't going to come to him in dramatic bursts of emotion, not in the way Jack had imagined. They would find their own paths, their own ways of expressing their grief, their anger, and their hopes. As the days passed, Jack made an effort to engage more with each of the boys, in different ways. Kyle's love for music became a bridge between them. Jack had always loved the guitar, and though he wasn't a great player, he knew enough to strum a few chords. Kyle's eyes lit up when Jack picked up his old guitar one afternoon and began playing a simple tune. They spent hours that evening playing together, Kyle's small hands struggling to get the chords right, but his joy was undeniable. The music was something Jack could see had been missing from their lives, and for the first time, it felt like they were all in tune with one another. Martin's curiosity remained as infectious as ever. He had taken to following Jack around the house, asking questions about everything he could think of, from the birds in the trees to the way the lawnmower worked. Jack found himself answering with patience he hadn't known he had, and over time, he started to look forward to these little moments of interaction. But it wasn't all easy. There were still difficult days. Days when Noah would retreat to his room and refuse to come out. Days when Kyle would snap at Jack, angry for reasons he couldn't even put into words. And Martin, as sweet as he was, would sometimes break into tears for no apparent reason, clinging to Jack as though the man could stop the world from hurting. Still, Jack pressed on. He understood now that healing wasn't a race. There was no finish line. They would all have to walk through their grief together, step by step, and sometimes the steps would be shaky. But the important thing was that they were walking together. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Jack felt a sense of peace growing in his heart. It was slow, but it was there. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He wasn't just the man who had taken in 3 boys out of some sense of obligation. He was becoming something more, something that would take time to define, but something real. And maybe, just maybe, this broken house, this fractured family, could become something whole again. The struggle of being enough. The days were getting longer, and with each passing week, Jack felt like he was inching closer to understanding the boys, closer to the point where they might begin to trust him completely. Yet, for all the progress, there was still a barrier between them. Jack had grown used to it by now, but that didn't make it any easier. He had been a father figure to them in his own way, but the truth was, it didn't feel like enough. They had their moments, laughs, shared meals, and even some light-hearted conversations, but underneath it all, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something more from him, something deeper, something he wasn't sure how to provide. Noah had started to open up in subtle ways, through his drawings, but Jack could still see that a large part of him remained closed off. Kyle, the music lover, had become more comfortable around Jack, often taking time to play together, but the boy's moods swung like the tides, sometimes cheerful, other times withdrawn and moody, as though he was trying to hold on to something Jack couldn't quite reach. And Martin, sweet, curious Martin, continued to ask questions and talk about anything that came to his mind. But his eyes often betrayed an underlying sadness that didn't match his energetic persona. One evening, as Jack was cleaning up after dinner, he overheard a conversation between Noah and Kyle in the living room. It wasn't much at first, just snippets of words, fragments of a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. But something in Noah's tone caught his attention, pulling him in like a tug at his heart. "Noah, we can't." Kyle's voice was anxious. "We can't go back there. It's not the same." Noah's voice was quiet but firm. "I know, but it doesn't feel right, Kyle. I still think about them every day. I can't help it." Jack's chest tightened as he quietly set down the dish he was washing. He moved closer, trying not to intrude on their moment, but unable to stop himself from listening. He had always known that the boys were holding on to memories of their parents, They had never really spoken about it in detail, not in a way that Jack could understand. But this felt like a conversation he couldn't ignore. Maybe we're not supposed to forget, Noah continued, his voice breaking slightly. Maybe we're supposed to remember, but I don't want to remember just to hurt. Jack took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady his emotions. He knew he wasn't supposed to be overhearing this. He knew the boys needed their space, their time to process things in their own way. But there was an undeniable ache in his chest, the kind of ache that came with knowing that, despite everything he was doing, he still wasn't fully the man they needed him to be. Jack stepped into the living room, his presence noticed instantly by both boys. Kyle quickly looked away, his face a mask of frustration, while Noah remained silent, staring down at the floor. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, Jack began, his voice soft, almost apologetic. But I know what you're going through. I can't replace your parents, and I would never try to. But if you want to talk about them, or anything else, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. The words hung in the air between them. Jack could see the resistance in Noah's eyes, the reluctance to let Jack in any further. But something in Kyle's expression softened just a little, and for the first time in weeks, Jack saw a tiny flicker of trust. I'm not asking you to forget, Jack added, his voice steady. But I am asking you to give me a chance. I know I can't replace them. I wouldn't try. But I can offer you something else. A family. A place where you're safe. A place where you can just be kids again. Noah's eyes shifted, studying Jack for a long moment. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the conversation had worn him down. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. I get it, Jack replied, nodding. And I'm not going to rush you. You can take all the time you need. But whenever you're ready, whenever any of you are ready, I'll be here. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate just a little, and after a long pause, Kyle broke the silence with a soft chuckle. Guess that means you're not going to make us sleep on the floor anymore, huh? He said, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jack laughed, the sound light and genuine. Not unless you start fighting over the couch again. The boys looked at each other, then back at Jack, and for the first time in a long while, they all shared a moment of real connection. It wasn't a huge breakthrough. It wasn't some monumental shift. But in that moment, Jack knew something important. They were beginning to trust him. Maybe not completely, and maybe not in all the ways he hoped, but it was a start. As the days passed, the tension in the house began to ease. The boys still had their struggles. Noah, especially, continued to wrestle with his emotions. He would retreat to his room for hours, or bury himself in his artwork. But Jack noticed that Noah wasn't avoiding him as much as he used to. When Jack offered a quiet, simple gesture, a hug after a bad day, a seat at the dinner table, a listening ear, Noah no longer recoiled. And that, Jack realized, was enough for now. Kyle had his moments too. Angry outbursts, times when his old carefree self seemed to disappear. But then there were other moments, quieter ones, when he would slip into the kitchen and sit next to Jack while he cooked, asking about his day or strumming his guitar in the background as Jack worked on his own projects around the house. Martin's curiosity continued to shine, and his unbridled joy at small things, whether it was a new toy or the simple pleasure of running through the sprinklers on a warm afternoon, reminded Jack that they were still kids. They had a long way to go, but they were moving in the right direction. Slowly, but surely. Jack had learned something in the last few weeks that he hadn't fully grasped before, that healing wasn't a process that could be rushed. There were no shortcuts. He wasn't going to magically transform into the father they needed, nor was he going to make their pain disappear, but he was going to show up. Every day. And that, he hoped, would be enough. One evening, as Jack sat in the living room with the boys, Noah drawing quietly, Kyle strumming on his guitar, and Martin flipping through a book, he felt something shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the feeling of a family coming together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Jack realized he wasn't just trying to be a father. He was becoming one. The burden of expectations. The days blurred together as the seasons shifted. What had once felt like a house filled with chaos and uncertainty slowly started to feel like something else, something Jack hadn't dared to hope for. Home. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden outpouring of emotion, but the boys were settling in. They were beginning to accept the reality of their new lives. The walls, once so heavily lined with grief and unspoken pain, now seemed to soften, the edges blurring into something more familiar. Yet, as Jack tried to adjust to this new rhythm, there were moments when the weight of the unspoken expectations hit him. Expectations that, he realized, he had placed on himself. He wasn't just trying to be a father. He wasn't just trying to offer comfort or guidance. No, there was an underlying pressure he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He had to prove to them that he was worthy, that he could be the kind of father who could make everything right. It wasn't enough to just give them a roof over their heads or provide them with meals. Jack had learned that much already. The real challenge was offering something deeper, something intangible that wasn't defined by actions but by the heart. And sometimes, no matter how much he tried to force it, Jack couldn't help but feel that there were gaps in what he could give, spaces where he couldn't reach them. One afternoon, as Jack was working in the garage, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see Noah standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking unusually distant. It wasn't like Noah to seek him out unless something was bothering him. And Jack immediately put down his tools, sensing the shift in the air. "You all right?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone casual, though he couldn't suppress the concern that laced his words. Noah hesitated before stepping fully into the garage. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, his voice low and uncertain. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and sat on the workbench, trying to make himself approachable without crowding Noah. "What kind of things?" Noah shuffled his feet, his gaze directed toward the floor. "About Mom and Dad. And about you." The words hit Jack like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. He'd been expecting some conversation like this to come up eventually, but now that it was happening, he felt at a loss. "I know it's not easy," Jack said softly. "I know there are things I can't fix, things I can't change. But if you ever need to talk about them, about your mom and dad, don't hesitate. I'm here for that too, no matter how hard it gets." Noah shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing slightly. "It's not just that. It's about you being here. I mean, I know you're trying, but it's like, sometimes I wonder if you're really, I don't know, ready to be our dad." Jack felt a pang of hurt, but he quickly masked it with a nod, understanding that Noah wasn't accusing him. He was simply trying to make sense of everything, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. "Noah, I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. I'm not your dad, not in the way your parents were, but I want to be here for you. I'm doing my best because you're my family now. And I will keep trying, every single day, to be what you need." Noah didn't respond immediately, but Jack could see that his words had planted a seed. Whether it would take root or not, Jack couldn't say. But at least it was something. At least it was progress. In the days that followed, Jack's thoughts were preoccupied with Noah's words. It wasn't that he wasn't trying. It was that the expectations he had placed on himself were too heavy. He had expected to be able to simply fill the gaps left by the boys' parents, to somehow make everything whole again. But Jack knew, deep down, that there were no perfect answers. No one could be everything all at once, and that included him. What he could give, though, was his unwavering presence, his patience and his love, in whatever form it took. But even as Jack grappled with his own inner turmoil, life marched on. The boys were continuing their lives, navigating their own journeys through their grief, their trauma, and their healing. They had their moments of peace and their moments of turmoil. There were nights when Kyle would stay up late, strumming his guitar and lost in the music, while Noah would retreat into his room, drawing and writing until the early hours of the morning. Martin, always the inquisitive one, would ask questions about the future, about how they could fix the broken pieces of their lives. Jack could see the changes happening. They were all healing, but at different paces in different ways. It was impossible to predict how long it would take for them to feel whole again. It was on one of these evenings, when the air outside was crisp and cool, that Jack was reminded of how far they'd come. The boys had been out in the backyard, playing a game of basketball, something they hadn't done in months. At first, it had been a tentative game, with hesitant passes and weak shots, but as time passed, it had turned into something more. Kyle had started to get competitive, joking around with the others and urging them to keep up. Noah had started laughing, a sound Jack hadn't heard in what felt like forever. And Martin, small and quick, was darting between them, scoring points with a grin on his face. The sight of them, so normal, so carefree, was both a relief and a bittersweet reminder of how much they had lost. Jack stood at the back door, watching them for a moment, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. He had done his best to hold it all together, to make sure they didn't fall apart. But in that moment, as he watched the boys laugh and argue over a missed shot, Jack realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. They had already started to heal. Maybe not fully, but enough. Enough to laugh, enough to fight, enough to feel like a family. "Hey, you're not playing," Kyle called out to Jack, his voice teasing. Jack smiled, stepping into the yard and raising his hands in mock surrender. "I think I'll sit this one out. You guys are too good for me now." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "You sure? I thought you were supposed to be good at everything." "Only in my dreams," Jack chuckled. "But I'll watch you guys play. I'll cheer you on." With that, he sat on the porch steps, letting the sounds of the game wash over him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack felt something shift in his heart. This was what family meant. The messiness, the struggle, the laughter, and even the pain. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up. It was about being there, no matter what. And as he watched the boys continue their game, Jack finally allowed himself to believe, deep down, that he was enough. Not because he had all the answers, not because he could make everything right, but because he was there, in that moment, with them. And that, for now, was more than enough. A family reborn. The days leading into the winter months were colder, and the early evening darkness came quicker, settling over Cedar Grove like a blanket. The snow had started to fall softly, blanketing the town in pristine white. It was peaceful, but to Jack, the stillness felt like the calm before a storm. It wasn't an external one, but one inside the house. An impending change, a shift that had been slowly building, yet he didn't know if he was ready for it. The boys had come a long way in the past year. Noah was still quiet at times, but he'd started to allow himself to show more of who he was. His artwork was no longer just an escape from his feelings, but a way of expressing his story, his grief, and his hopes. Kyle had become more open, no longer bottling up his emotions in anger or humor, but learning to voice them, especially when they needed to talk about their parents. And Martin, sweet Martin, had grown into the boy Jack had always hoped he would be. His laughter was the light that filled every room, and his questions were no longer driven by confusion, but curiosity about his future. They weren't perfect, but they were healing. They were together, and for Jack, that was the greatest accomplishment he could ask for. It was in the middle of November when Jack felt the weight of the impending conversation coming. He hadn't anticipated how the holidays would affect the boys. He had been busy with work, making sure they had everything they needed. But when the first of the holiday decorations went up in Cedar Grove, something stirred in the air. Jack had been toying with the idea of asking the boys to officially adopt him as their father, an idea that had seemed like a distant, impossible dream only months ago, but now it felt like something they might be ready for. The thought of it terrified him. He didn't want to push too hard, didn't want to risk overwhelming them, but he also didn't want to wait too long. What if they needed more time? What if they still weren't ready? It was Noah who finally brought it up, one evening as they sat together in the living room. The soft hum of Christmas carols drifted from the radio, and the boys were scattered around, engaged in their own quiet activities. Noah was drawing, his pencil moving steadily across the page, while Kyle tuned his guitar, muttering to himself about needing to learn a new song for the school talent show. Martin was fiddling with his toy soldiers on the coffee table, lost in his own little world. Jack sat down beside Noah, glancing at the boy's sketchbook. It had become a ritual, sitting with Noah in silence, giving him space to share his work when he was ready. And tonight, Noah seemed ready. "I was thinking," Noah began, his voice soft, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what you said, that you want to be here for us. Always." Jack looked at him, his heart skipping a beat. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew it was important. "Yeah," Jack replied, keeping his tone light, though he couldn't hide the catch in his voice. Noah hesitated, his hand pausing mid-sketch. "I've been thinking about that, too. About you being here. I know it's not the same as what it used to be, but I think I'm starting to get it." Jack's chest tightened as he listened, trying to keep his emotions in check. "What do you mean, buddy?" Noah looked up from his drawing, his eyes meeting Jack's with a seriousness that made Jack's heart swell. "I mean, I think I understand now that you don't have to be like them to be a dad. I don't think I ever really understood what that meant before. I thought it was just about doing the big stuff, the stuff you can't mess up. But now, I don't know. You've been there for us, even when things were hard, even when we didn't want to talk. You've been there. You've loved us." The words hit Jack like a wave. He could feel the weight of them, the significance of what Noah was offering. For a moment, Jack couldn't speak. His throat tightened as the years of uncertainty, a feeling like he wasn't enough, faded away. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for. "You mean it?" Jack's voice cracked, but it didn't matter. He felt a smile tug at his lips, the joy of the moment far too overwhelming for him to contain. Noah nodded slowly, as if letting the words settle into his own heart before speaking them aloud. "Yeah, I do." For a long while, neither of them said anything more. It wasn't needed. The air between them had shifted, softened, deepened, like the first thaw of spring after a long winter. Jack didn't have to ask any more questions. He didn't have to seek reassurance or confirmation. Noah had said it, and in that moment, Jack knew with every fiber of his being that they were family. But even so, there was still the question of what this meant for the future. Jack had always dreamed of having a family of his own, but now that the boys were a part of his life, he wondered if he was ready to truly step into that role. Could he handle the pressure of being a father for all three of them, not just for a moment but for the rest of their lives? It was a question Jack had been avoiding, but the weight of Noah's words pressed against him. He didn't need to be perfect, and he didn't have to have all the answers. What mattered was that he was there for them, in the good times and the bad. He had shown up, and that was enough. The next day, Jack sat down with Kyle and Martin in the living room. It was just the three of them. Noah had gone out with a friend for the afternoon, and Jack knew this was the time to talk. "Hey, you two," Jack said, his voice steady, but with a tenderness that reflected how much this conversation meant. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be family, and what it means to be your dad." Kyle raised an eyebrow, looking at him with some curiosity. Martin didn't speak, but he looked up from his book, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "I've never been the kind of guy who has all the answers," Jack continued, trying to keep things light. "But I'm learning, just like you guys. And I'm here. I'm here for all of you. Every single day. Kyle glanced at Martin before looking back at Jack. You don't have to be perfect, Jack, he said, his voice surprisingly mature for his age. We know you're trying, and that's what matters. You're here. That's all we need. Martin nodded enthusiastically. Yeah. You're like our dad now, right? Like a real one. Jack's heart swelled. It was such a simple thing, yet in that moment, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted. There it was, the thing he had been hoping for, the thing he wasn't sure he would ever hear. You know, Jack said, blinking back tears, I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. And just like that, it wasn't just words anymore. It wasn't some idea Jack had been holding on to. It was real. He had a family now. Not a perfect family, but a real one. And that was enough. As Christmas approached, the Henderson house was filled with more than just decorations. It was filled with love, with laughter, with memories that would last a lifetime. Jack looked at his boys, his sons, his family, and he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that, more than anything, was what truly made them a family.